Rolling Up. Chapter 2. Royal Marine Volunteer. In 1948 the government decreed all men over the age of 18 were to take part in 2 years' national service in one of the 3 services. These years could be deferred, ensuring apprenticeships and training schemes were completed before entering. I elected to do my national service during my apprenticeship and serve an extra year to make up for the 2 years lost. That meant I would be out of my time as a journeyman by the time I was 21. The 3 years spent as an apprentice soon went by. A group of us lads in the Boys Brigade decided to join the Royal Marine Forces Volunteer Reserve, based at Moorgate in London. I think it was only the thrill of the challenge and the uniform which drove us on. By signing on, it allowed us to do our national service time spent in the unit that normally wouldn't take 2-year entrance. Meanwhile, my best friend David Villas left North London Polytechnic to start a job with a northern-based newspaper as a trainee sports correspondent. The Royal Marines formed in the middle of the 17th century to be part of the complement on board capital ships. They were mainly there to act as guardians to the captain and officers, and accommodated on mess decks that separated officers from men. Their secondary job was to guard the officers' quarters, gangways, embarkation entries, quarterdeck, cells and gunnery decks, and during the battle they not only guarded those spaces but platforms in the ship's rigging, to kill opposing sharpshooters and to maim the directing officers of opposing ships. In many instances they provided shore-going raiding parties and acting as special forces. The Corps of Royal Marines divided into 3 wings: Sea Service, previously described, the Commandos, and Amphibious. The term of Commando originated from the Boer War. They were mounted light infantry, commanded to hit and run as armed raiding parties. Their task was not to be bogged down by conventional warfare situations by holding positions, awaiting backup troops and provisions, but to be flexible in approach. Churchill ordered the forming of commando units during the Second World War, with a similar job in mind. It wasn't long before splinter groups, special forces, began to be formed which attended to specific tasks. All these groups, landing craft for infantry and tanks, small boat raiding craft, special boat section, beach control parties, boom defence, underwater swimmers, divers and shoreline specialists, were amalgamated into the Amphibious section, Royal Marines at Poole. As soon as we were kitted, we had to attend lectures on the history of the Corps and to fall in for basic drill. It was all very normal and friendly. Great emphasis was made that the detachment was a large family. It expected that we would attend as many lecture nights and informal occasions as possible. It didn't take us many weeks before we were considered fit to march in public and wear the uniform on every occasion. Now, most of my weekends were booked for rifle shooting. We all arrived at the Moorgate drill hall, where a Royal Navy truck took us to one of the 2 ranges, Bickley or Purbright. Our Saturday nights were spent in the huts close to the rifle range. Now, even my reading times taken over, evenings and weekends were now completely filled. The commando training took place on the Welsh hills, where camping out was normally held during the winter. Route and speed marches, organised for groups and pairs, map reading and survival training were all part of the experience. I don't remember anyone dropping out or questioning what we were instructed to do. We were given basic infantry training with a modicum of unarmed combat, cliff climbing, rope work plus the usual assault courses. And after attending regularly for over 9 months and passing a series of commando exercises in the Welsh hills, route marches and target practice, we finally climbed Snowdon, which earned our green beret. Every year, in November, the Royal Marine Volunteer Reserve were invited to contribute a contingent towards the Lord Mayor's inaugural show. A squad, including myself, practised drill and marching on the Honourable Artillery Company's drill square, which was just next door. For weeks before the event, there was also a regular monthly dance attended in walking-out uniform. The canteen bar was always open, which provided a decorative backdrop to the occasion. It was without doubt an excellent convivial company, without any stress or bad feelings generated from any quarter. Everyone was a volunteer and wanted to be there and to take part in all the activities. The year was up. It was now 1953. I was 18. Mrs. Dale's Diary, the most successful radio soap, gave the life of a doctor's wife that was distinctly upper middle class in content. 50% of all children went to Sunday school, and about the same percentage of boys enrolled in a youth organisation. Although I didn't recognise the fact, the Consumer Society was about to gather momentum. My call-up papers arrived, and off I went to Lympstone, Devon, to do my infantry training, which was to take 17 weeks. I became one of the 843 squad, and during our training we had instruction on personal hygiene, how to wash and iron, how to clean our teeth, what to wear, how to wear it, and how to clean it. Corps history was emphasized, reinforced by a simple written test, contraception matters, and a medical with its attendant jabs and inoculations. We had the pleasure to make up a concert party for the annual Christmas party. Most people would think that the training would follow how things were done in the conventional army. After all, it was infantry training. But there was a concerted effort by Royal Marine instructors to be different from the army. I never heard a swear word by our company sergeant major during our drill, or by our small arms instructor. In fact, swearing never adopted by any of the staff. The raised voice, too, was something frowned upon. All commands were made just loud enough for those men under instruction to hear. There was no exaggerated stamping of feet. These changes from army habit to Royal Marine difference was recognised and emphasised. It was instilled in us to be different, not just for difference sake, but because it was considered to be a better way. Every man who passed the entrance inspections was accepted, whatever his height. There was a further emphasis on initiative, freedom of movement to achieve the object, and sometimes choice of weapons to be carried. The esprit de corps engendered a dedication not to let down the squad or section to those around him who were to be considered a close-knit family. My 10-week infantry training started October 1953. I arrived at Waterloo Station and travelled down to Lympstone in Devon in company with some other lads who were joining up. I had to leave my uniform behind to be reissued when I got there. We were to make up the complement of 843 Squad for basic training, led by Colour Sergeant Snowdon. There was about 50 of us split into 2 huts, with the corporal in charge of each. We started our training a more complete version of what we volunteers had been doing for the past year, and towards the end of our 10 weeks, Christmas 1953, the squad enrolled in a Christmas concert party to sing 2 songs. Marbella Margarita and Little David, trained and conducted by the surgeon lieutenant. 2 days later, we went home on leave to start our next assignment, when we arrived back to continue training in our chosen wing. After our initial training, we had to make a choice between 3 wings: 4-5 Commando, who were in Malaya, Amphibious section at Poole Harbour, and Sea Service. Having been in the Commandos, I elected to go into sea service, fancying a trip round the world with sunshine, grass-skirted native girls, the sound of Hawaiian chants, and the sun glittering on the wave-tops around Gibraltar, Singapore, and Barbados. What a shock I was going to have! I was detached and sent to Whale Island Gunnery School, Portsmouth, with a small group to attend a gunnery course, scheduled to last 4 weeks. Here all recruits had to double to all lectures, demonstrations and practices. It was freezing cold, being in midwinter, and it snowed most of the time. The practice completed firing the 4.7 guns, the standard gunnery piece, and all the equipment was old and much used, evident by the amount of paint that had been built up on the carriages. The 4 training weeks went by quickly, and found the squad hanging round the company notice board to see what ships were allocated to them. At last my name appeared, telling me to present myself to Portsmouth Harbour, where HMS Illustrious, a large, by British standards, aircraft carrier, was taking in stores and additional crew, and built by Vickers Armstrong and launched on April the 5th, 1939, commissioned a year later at Barrow to carry 52 aircraft. The ship was now nearly 20 years old. I was one of half a dozen Royal Marines who had to present ourselves to the officer of the watch, get ourselves new kit, be instructed to the hammock, be shown our mess deck, and where to sling mine, and where to eat, for just over a year. It would be nice to be able to say that for all the time I spent on board I learnt valuable lessons, was introduced to exciting experiences, and prepared myself for taking an active part in modern Britain, and be shown how efficient and up-to-date our military might was. However, I cannot say that. We were a training ship for air crews, and sailed out into mainly coastal waters to fly off and land on planes. At action stations my post was on the island, operating one of the 17 Bofor guns. The ship was leaking, to the extent that the pumps could hardly control the inflow of water. Most of the equipment was out of date and extensively used. There were many crashes and frequent ditching of written-off planes. Whereas the ship's naval crew were fully occupied running the ship, and the fleet air arm fully engaged with their aircraft, we, the Royal Marines, were monstrously scrubbing decks, standing guard, and operating some of the guns. There was absolutely no point in us being there at all, firing the guns to give the air crews a taste of attacking through simulated ack-ack fire. This practice firing could have been performed equally well by the Navy ratings. As for scrubbing decks, we had to make do with hand scrubbers only, and take up water with cloths. Long-handled brooms and squeegees were banned. At one stage we took on board a new replacement set of Royal Marines who had flown back to the UK after having just come out of the jungles of Malaya. Now it was their turn to scrub decks and paint ship. What a waste of experienced fighting men by military planners. Whilst on board, I struck up a friendship with another Marine who had his coxswain's ticket for dinghy sailing, and he asked me if I would crew for him. Thereafter, wherever HMS Illustrious entered port, if suitable harbour facilities, we would launch our general purpose 14 dinghy and have a sail. This we did on many occasions, becoming quite expert at launching and coming into position to be hoisted inboard. To launch, we had to arrange for a forklift driver to carry the boat out of the hangar onto the lift and deposit it under the crane. Then the crane driver would drop the boat over the side, and we would pick it up after guiding it under the gangway ladder. Anything under a force 5 wind, which was not about to increase, we could sail. If a gale was imminent, a cone was hoisted, and this warning had to be obeyed, and return on board immediately. On one occasion in Belfast we went out on a lovely day in a force 3 wind and sailed for over an hour, testing ourselves by going about and close hauling into the wind. By this time we were quite some way away from the ship, and didn't notice that the wind was rising. When we thought we ought to return, we looked to the ship and saw that they had hoisted a cone. We set about returning on board, only to discover the wind and tide against us, coming on shore into Belfast Bay, and the sea starting to get up, making a return trip more lengthy. We started tacking furiously, trying to make headway. By this time, even we could see that the waves were beginning to be considerably fiercer, and I do not think that we needed to look at each other to realise that we had ourselves in quite a pickle. At last we began to get sufficiently near to the ship to see that she was streaming before the wind and tide, which didn't allow us any lee to shelter under. We could then sail to either side for hoisting inboard. The officer of the watch was there, as well as the guards and duty crane driver. The side of the aircraft carrier is, I suppose, as high as a 5-floor block of flats. The sides curved upwards and outwards, overhanging anything beneath, all accentuating height, weight, and mass. It's intimidating, I can assure you. This was all becoming decidedly embarrassing, and we knew that the flight deck personnel would be attending the steam catapult gear for repairs, for they had been there when we had left. There were times in my life when I wished I had many miles away from where I was at that moment, and this was one of them. What was needed now was a very slick pick-up of the hook and speedy exit from our embarrassment. As we came up to the extended boom which was projecting outside of the ship, the booms, perhaps 2 or more on either side of the ship, had trailing ropes for small boats to tie up to, and rope ladders for boat exit and entry. We got into a position for the crane driver to lower the pulley and hook. We could see that the choppiness of the water, which by this time had a 4 to 5 foot rise and fall. Now if you can imagine the scene, a large pulley block and a hook about the size of a small car wheel and weighing about 1 hundredweight, with 4 pieces of spliced wire, each with their spliced eyelet, for attaching to the dinghy, and all swaying about above your head, whilst you're rising and sinking with the waves. Now all that is bad enough if there's just you, your mate, and the crane driver in attendance. In this case, however, all our antics were being observed with great interest by a gathering group of well-wishers, and an even greater group of loafers who had had it up to then a boring day, wanting to be entertained, and watch somebody else in trouble. It was very difficult to stay up with the trailing rope ladder, to grab hold of it without being plucked out of the dinghy. For the umpteenth time we tacked into position only to be forced back. At one time we ended up with our mast under the boom, and as a wave jerked us up, the mast caught under the boom and released it from its cradle. These booms were about 20 feet long and over 2 feet in circumference. It swung round and smashed against the ship's side, that brought a muted cheer from the onlookers. I say muted because that crash heralded the irate face of the commander peering over the side, and a stream of shouts emanating from his now reddening face. We had to make our way to the next forward boom, with a trailing group of watchers, both official and some frankly stirrers of the spilling pot. Here the trailing rope and rope ladder were adjacent. I managed to mount the ladder, whilst this time holding on to the bowline, and with this I let it out to pull it up so that the pulley was directly over the dinghy. My friend shackled on, and the crane took up the weight. Now he and the boat were hoisted up onto the deck, with a loud cheer from all the faces filling the portholes all along the ship's side. We were ever so careful after that. During my time aboard ship, the captain of marines asked me what my job was before joining up, and when he heard I had been a trained artist, he lost no time in asking for a picture of his wife to be sketched. This soon brought in many other requests, which, although brought me in much wanted cash, it prevented me from going on shore. However, what it did do is have me transferred to the painting store section, where I was placed under the chief petty officer, whose part-time job was painting ships' crests. These ships' crests were made by mould, painted and gilded, plaster of Paris, ordered by the ship's captain to present to visiting dignitaries or similar officials when the ship put into dock, in home or ports abroad. Our presentation plaques were extremely well made and finely decorated. No expense was spared to ensure that they were perfectly produced. Any gilt was in gold leaf, and the final operation was a coating of varnish. The rest of my time spent aboard served in the paint store, except when detailed off for watchkeeping as corporal of the gangway, first making sure that a store of plaques had been put by ready for issue. My other call to fame was when the ship called at Trondheim, Norway, and a ship's band was called for. As I had been a drummer in the boys' brigade, I found myself roped into this scratch band to augment the ship's Royal Marine buglers, who were also drummers. Thankfully, this was a one-off, and my skills were not called for again. During one of my leaves from the National Service, my father's lodge held his annual dance. He invited me along, and therefore, making up a party of 3, including my mother, we made our way to the Kensington Lodge, where we met up with my father's friends, Nobby Clark, his wife and daughter, at whose table we sat. Naturally, I danced with the daughter, who told me that she worked for a legal secretary in London. How I came to pluck up sufficient courage to ask her out I don't know, but I did, and so a relationship blossomed, even after her telling me that she was unofficially engaged to a chap who was in Australia. That year, Stan got married to Jean after courting her for over a year. He was 20 and Jean 18. The marriage conducted at the Methodist Church, North Harrow. Stan was not sure that getting married at such an early age was both sensible and wise, but continued with the inevitable course. I was the best man, and to match the groom, remember buying my first charcoal grey suit. They both settled down to marriage life in rented accommodation, in walking distance from his old home. I was still doing my national service, and Derek was 12. My relationship with Barbara continued for a few more months. I mentioned to her about getting engaged, trying to put a more committed basis to our friendship. I'm sure my brother's wedding and my mentioning engagement prompted Barbara to make a choice, and within a short period she broke off the friendship, saying that she was going to marry the chap she was engaged to. I was so annoyed, and I couldn't believe that someone would be so deceitful, being led to believe the other chap was but a memory. We were so near to announcing our engagement. I think the Clarks were upset and annoyed with their daughter. I remember being so miffed that I told my mother, and that her reply was that I should not let it upset me. A fat lot of good that was. I was hopping mad. My second flirt with the opposite sex occurred later, when I went out with a girl that I'd met at a dance studio in Wembley. Janet lived in Sudbury Hill and was a local beauty queen. We went out together for some months, and over Christmas invited to our family festivities. She wanted to dance, and through a total lack of understanding on my part, I thought it silly to dance in our front room. I was still utterly unsophisticated, lacking social graces, subtleties of courtship, or showing romantic feelings and desires. Once again, my dealings with the opposite sex were short-lived, plagued by misunderstandings and lacking sexual awareness regarding what to do and when to do it. I had to do a lot better than this if I wasn't going to be destined for the shelf. In 1954, after a visit to Aberdeen in June, Illustrious was taken out of service, destined for the breaker's yard. Again I had to choose where I'd like to go within the Corps. A chance was offered to go to the Amphibious wing in Poole, Dorset, which was now the main school for infantry landing craft, beach control, small boat section and raiding parties. My request was accepted, and so off I went to Poole to do a landing craft stoker's course, the aim of which was to produce engine room mechanics. I learnt all about Ford marine engines, trained to occupy the engine compartment, maintain the engines and drive the craft. The stoker of an infantry landing craft sits between these two in-line engines, with the two propeller shafts spinning either side of you. two levers engaged the drive for forward and reverse, and the throttles connected to the carburetors determined the revolutions. The telegraphs are placed on the bulkhead either side of the armoured door in front of you, which is clamped shut during a landing, so too the round hatch above your head. Its top speed was about 11 knots. However, the craft was extremely active in rough water, and because of its slab side, easily affected by a strong wind blowing on the craft's quarter during a landing. I suppose that as an analogy you might imagine going to sea in a tin bath. It wasn't something that you would wish to be in when landing on an enemy shore covered by well dug-in heavy machine guns, when occupied kedging off whilst worrying about the 30 or so troops waiting to land. It was equally difficult to disembark or embark troops from a heaving troopship which towers above your head with a choppy sea running. With just 4 months before being demobbed, I was asked to present myself to the beach control section, to join their small team. Now all my days were taken up signalling, sorting out beach signs and learning how to set up a beach landing position on an enemy shore. These were probably my most interesting days spent during the whole of my national service. Days were spent discussing various beach conditions which might have to be dealt with to allow entry over, trying to visualize for every possible attack. Eventually my time was up, and I had to report to Eastney Barracks for discharge. Joining the Royal Marines had been a serious mistake. I was not considering the Corps as a full-time career. I should have completed my apprenticeship and completed my City and Guilds course. My knowledge of the industry, other processes and trades, unknown to me, I was ignorant of the advances taking place in technology. I should have instead applied to join the Royal Engineers, who had within their service a mapping section, the survey section, which catered for all the Army's printings and pre-printing processes. It was an allied trade, and would have helped me in civilian life and to keep me in touch with other printing trades and techniques. After leaving my national service, I had to do a further 6 years as a volunteer reserve, and after the first camp, a 2-week camp in Malta on landing craft, I didn't show my face again until I handed in my kit 5 years later. About 160,000 men were called up each year beginning in 1948, and by the time I served, the Malayan conflict was the main drain on these resources. The national service was much to do with social control as to provide a defence force. It broke up family links, disrupted apprenticeships, imposed harsh anti-social training, and became a political tool. The national service preserved the status quo for a martial class-ridden society.